Think you know Ragnar Lothbrok from the hit TV series Vikings? The fierce warrior king who conquered Paris, ruled vast territories, and fathered legendary sons? Well, here's the truth that might shock you. There's virtually no solid historical evidence that Ragnar Lothbrok ever existed as the man we see on screen. The real story is far more complex, blending fragments of possible history with centuries of Norse mythology and modern Hollywood fantasy. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's greatest mysteries, separating the Viking legend from historical reality. Get ready to discover what scholars actually know about the man called Ragnar Lothbrok, the problem with Ragnar, what the evidence actually shows. Let's start with the hard truth that most people don't want to hear. According to academic consensus, based on critical analysis of primary sources, there is no definitive historical or archaeological evidence confirming Ragnar Lothbrok as a real individual. He's best understood as a legendary figure whose story blends myth with possible historical prototypes. Now, before you think I'm just trying to ruin your favorite TV show, let me explain what this actually means. When historians say there's no evidence, they're not saying some guy named Ragnar never existed. They're saying we can't prove the specific person described in the sagas, with all his legendary exploits, his multiple wives, his dramatic death, and his famous sons, was a real historical figure. The problem is sources. Contemporary written evidence from the 9th century, when Ragnar supposedly lived, is incredibly scarce. The Vikings themselves didn't write much down during this period. Most of what we know comes from their enemies, the Anglo-Saxons and the Franks, who were more concerned with recording their own victories and defeats than creating detailed biographies of Viking leaders. What we do have are mentions in sources like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Frankish records of Viking leaders named Ragnar and Reginherus, who were active in the 840s. These might have inspired the Ragnar legend, but connecting them definitively to the saga character is where things get murky. The saga sources, medieval fan fiction or historical record. The main sources for Ragnar Lothbrok's story come from much later periods. We're talking about the 13th century Icelandic Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and Book 9 of Saxo Grammaticus's 12th century Gesta Danorum. That's 300 to 400 years after Ragnar supposedly lived. Think about that for a moment. Imagine trying to write an accurate biography of someone from the 1600s using only stories passed down through generations, with no written records from their actual lifetime. That's essentially what these medieval writers were doing. Saxo Grammaticus, a Danish historian writing around 1200 AD, was trying to create a comprehensive history of Denmark. His Gesta Danorum is a Latin chronicle that consolidates various legendary and possibly historical Viking figures into the character of Ragnar. The problem is, Saxo sometimes attributes to Ragnar deeds that other sources credit to different individuals entirely. The Icelandic Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok is even more problematic from a historical standpoint. It's what scholars call a legendary saga, essentially a blend of myth, folklore, and possible historical events designed to entertain and connect Icelandic families to heroic ancestors. These sagas focus on dramatic storytelling rather than historical accuracy. Modern scholarship generally considers most stories about Ragnar to be legendary rather than strictly historical. Some scholars accept that elements of his saga may be based on real events or people, but separating fact from fiction is nearly impossible. The Reginherus connection, a possible historical prototype. Here's where things get interesting. While we can't prove Ragnar Lothbrok existed as described in the sagas, there is a historical figure who might have inspired the legend, a Viking leader named Reginherus. Reginherus is documented in Frankish sources as the commander who led the famous siege of Paris in 845 AD. According to these records, he commanded a fleet of 120 ships, sailed up the Seine River, and attacked Paris when it was still a relatively small settlement on an island in the river. The Frankish chroniclers describe how Reginherus's forces defeated the Frankish army and then withdrew after receiving a massive ransom from Charles the Bald, the Frankish king. This is solid, contemporary historical evidence. The kind historians love because it comes from people who were actually there or close to the events. Many scholars consider Reginherus the most plausible historical prototype for Ragnar Lothbrok. The names are similar, the timeline fits, and the Paris siege is one of the most famous exploits attributed to Ragnar in the later sagas. However, even this identification can't be conclusively proven due to limited and sometimes conflicting sources. sources. What's fascinating is how this one historical event, the 845 siege of Paris, grew in the telling over centuries. By the time the sagas were written, it had become part of a much larger, more dramatic story involving multiple sieges, elaborate tricks, and legendary heroes. The archaeological silence, what the ground doesn't tell us. One of the most telling aspects of the Ragnar question is what archaeology doesn't show us. Despite decades of Viking Age excavations across Scandinavia and the British Isles, no direct archaeological evidence has been found that can be conclusively linked to Ragnar Lothbrok himself. We're talking about no grave, no runestone, no artifact that says, "Here lies Ragnar," or "Ragnar was here," for a figure supposedly as important and powerful as the sagas claim. This silence is significant. Now, this doesn't prove he didn't exist. Plenty of historical figures leave little archaeological trace. But it does mean we can't use physical evidence to support the saga accounts. Interestingly, some archaeological finds are associated with Ragnar's supposed sons, particularly Ivar the Boneless. There's a mass grave at Repton in England that some scholars believe might contain remains of Vikings from the Great Heathen Army, possibly including Ivar. But even these connections are speculative rather than definitive. The sons of Ragnar, more legend than history. Speaking of Ragnar's sons, let's talk about what we actually know versus what the sagas claim. According to legend, Ragnar fathered several famous Viking leaders, including Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Hvitserk, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye. The problem is, there's no direct archaeological evidence confirming that any of these figures were historical sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. Their relationship is primarily based on later medieval sagas and legends, not contemporary records. Ivar the Boneless is mentioned in Norse sagas as a son of Ragnar and a leader of the Great Heathen Army that invaded England in 865. He's sometimes identified with the historical Viking leader Ymir, who was active in Ireland and Britain in the late 9th century. But the connection to Ragnar isn't supported by contemporary sources, and even the details of his famous nickname remain debated among scholars. Bjorn Ironside faces similar problems. He's described in sagas as another son of Ragnar, and a famous raider who supposedly led expeditions to the Mediterranean, but his historicity is uncertain, and the main sources about him are those same 13th century sagas, not archaeological finds or contemporary chronicles. What we do know is that the Great Heathen Army was real. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled in the late 9th century, provides contemporary evidence of this large coalition of Scandinavian warriors who landed in East Anglia in 865 and subsequently campaigned across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Archaeological evidence, including large winter camps at places like Torksey and Repton, corroborates this account. But connecting this historical invasion to the legendary sons of a possibly legendary father, that's where the evidence gets thin. What Hollywood got spectacularly wrong. Now let's talk about what the History Channel's Vikings series got wrong about Ragnar Lothbrok, and there's a lot to unpack here. First, and most fundamentally, the show presents Ragnar as a definitively real historical figure, when, as we've seen, his existence is highly debated among scholars. The series takes the saga accounts at face value and presents them as historical fact, which is problematic from an academic standpoint. The show also commits what historians call timeline compression, cramming events that happen decades apart into a single character's lifetime. For example, the series shows Ragnar leading both the famous raid on Lindisfarne in 793 and the siege of Paris in 845. That's a 52-year span, which would make Ragnar impossibly old if he participated in both events as an active warrior. Even more problematic, some exploits shown as Ragnar's in the TV series were actually attributed to other Vikings in the historical sources. The famous trick of infiltrating Paris by faking death, for instance, was actually credited to his son Bjorn in some saga accounts, not Ragnar himself. The show also misrepresents Viking identity itself. The term Viking wasn't used as a self-identity in the 9th century the way it's depicted in the series. Viking was more of an activity. Going a Viking meant going raiding. These people would have identified themselves by their region, their clan, or their leader, not as Vikings in the modern sense. Then there are the smaller but still significant inaccuracies. The costumes, the hairstyles, the weapons, even the way they're shown discovering new lands. The series presents a romanticized Hollywood version of Viking culture that often contradicts what archaeology and historical sources actually tell us. The real Viking Age, what we actually know. So, if Ragnar Lothbrok, as portrayed in popular culture, is largely legendary, what do we actually know about the Viking Age and the people who lived through it? The Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 AD, was a period of Scandinavian Scandinavian expansion across Europe and beyond. These weren't just mindless raiders. They were traders, explorers, settlers, and yes, sometimes warriors. They established trade networks that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople, founded cities like Dublin and York, and influenced the development of medieval Europe in profound ways. The raids that made them famous were often economically motivated. Monasteries and churches were targeted not because Vikings hated Christianity, though religious differences played a role, but because these institutions were wealthy and often poorly defended. Viking society was more complex than popular culture suggests. They had sophisticated legal systems, rich oral traditions, and remarkable seafaring technology. Their longships were marvels of engineering that allowed them to navigate both open seas and shallow rivers. Women in Viking society had more rights and freedoms than their counterparts in many other medieval cultures. They could own property, request divorces, and some even served as warriors. Though the extent of female participation in warfare remains debated among scholars. The power of legend. Why Ragnar endures. So why does Ragnar Lothbrok continue to captivate us, even if he might not have existed as described? The answer lies in the power of legend itself. Ragnar represents something that resonates across cultures and centuries. The idea of the larger-than-life hero who defies the odds, conquers his enemies, and leaves a lasting legacy. Whether he was real or not, his story embodies themes that speak to fundamental human experiences: the struggle for freedom, the desire for adventure, the complex relationship between civilization and wildness. The sagas that preserved his story weren't trying to write history in the modern sense. They were creating meaning, connecting their audiences to a heroic past, and exploring timeless themes through compelling narratives. In that sense, they succeeded brilliantly. Modern adaptations like the Vikings series continue this tradition, using the Ragnar legend to explore contemporary themes about leadership, family, faith, and cultural change. The historical accuracy matters less than the story's ability to illuminate human nature and experience. The scholar's verdict: separating myth from possible reality. After examining all the evidence, or lack thereof, what can we conclude about Ragnar Lothbrok? The scholarly consensus is that Ragnar, as described in the sagas, is primarily a legendary figure. However, this doesn't mean the stories are entirely fictional. They likely preserve memories of real events and real people, woven together and embellished over centuries of oral tradition. The most probable scenario is that various historical Viking leaders, possibly including Reginherus, who attacked Paris in 845, inspired the composite figure we know as Ragnar Lothbrok. The sagas took these historical fragments and created a unified narrative that served their storytelling purposes. This process of legendary development is common in medieval literature. Think of King Arthur, who may have been based on a real Romano-British leader, but whose story grew far beyond any historical reality. Or consider how American folk heroes like Davy Crockett became larger-than-life figures, whose legendary exploits overshadowed their actual biographies. What makes Ragnar's case particularly interesting is how modern media has taken this already legendary figure and created yet another layer of interpretation. The History Channel's Vikings isn't just adapting medieval sagas, it's creating a new mythology for contemporary audiences. The importance of historical skepticism. Understanding the Ragnar Lothbrok question teaches us something important about how we approach history. It's tempting to want our heroes to be real, to have definitive answers about the past, but good history requires us to be comfortable with uncertainty, and to distinguish between what we can prove and what we'd like to believe. This doesn't mean we should dismiss the sagas or stop enjoying modern adaptations. These stories have value as literature, as cultural artifacts, and as entertainment, but we should understand them for what they are: creative interpretations of the past rather than documentary accounts. The real Viking Age was fascinating enough without legendary embellishment. The people who lived through it faced genuine challenges, achieved remarkable things, and left a lasting impact on world history. Their actual stories, the ones we can document and verify, are worth telling and remembering. Modern lessons from an ancient mystery. What can we learn from the Ragnar Lothbrok phenomenon in our current age of information, overload, and competing narratives? First, it reminds us of the importance of source criticism. Just because something is widely believed or frequently repeated doesn't make it true. The popularity of the Vikings series has led many people to accept its version of history without questioning the evidence behind it. Second, it shows us how legends develop and spread. The Ragnar story evolved over centuries, with each generation adding new elements and interpretations. Today, we're witnessing a similar process as modern media creates new versions of old stories. Finally, it illustrates the ongoing tension between entertainment and education. There's nothing wrong with enjoying fictional or semi-fictional accounts of the past, but we should be clear about what we're consuming and why. The legend of Ragnar Lothbrok represents more than just one possibly fictional Viking. It's a window into how history, myth, and modern storytelling intersect. While we may never know if the man himself truly existed, his story continues to evolve, reflecting our ongoing fascination with the Viking Age and our need for larger-than-life heroes. What's remarkable is how accessible the real history remains for those willing to dig deeper than Hollywood's version. If you have enjoyed raiding the past with us, then go ahead and pillage that like button and subscribe for more interesting journeys into the world of Midgard living.